I've been playing Hela in Eternity and won above all since season 0. I even took a break for 2 seasons, I came back, and I was still able to keep playing her in Eternity. This is how you carry game after game, no matter how many times they change her or the game around her, no matter how long you've been out of the game. Let's get straight into it. Alright, first and foremost, I believe Hela becomes much easier when you learn how to position correctly, so that's going to be the first thing that I'm going to cover. I tend to play in a position that's near my team, but also near a flank at the same time, rather than always sitting in my own backline. This can change if I feel like the enemy team is pressuring me a lot of the time, or if they have flankers that can surprise me in 1v1s, but being near a flank means that as the fight plays out, I have the option to quickly change position to hit the game-winning shots that I need to hit. If you're the kind of person to always play in your own backline, you are going to struggle to find openings that are wide enough for you to actually secure kills, especially as you get up to the higher ranks. That doesn't mean that they're never going to show up, but they're going to become few and far in between. So in general, think of where a nice off angle would be and play close enough that you can set up on it in only a couple of seconds without using your bird to do so. I say without using your bird because your bird is going to be important for you to escape the off angle and get help if need be, or sometimes you can even use it to chase further into the enemy backline as the supports try to escape you. So if they're 1 HP, you can sort of bird above them and get that final blow. And positioning can change a little bit when you're defending on payload maps, especially, such as the Wakanda one. On defense, I love to wait around a corner and watch using the third-person camera to my advantage, and then when somebody swings out in the open like an enemy support, I'll go ahead and I'll peek them and try to kill them, because it's going to be harder for them to get away from me when they're in the open. The last thing that I want to mention on positioning in particular will come into play when both teams start to use their support ults. Now, unless you've been pressured out of the angle already, or you know that people are looking at you, you can use the trading of support ults to set up a surprise flank. It's pretty much the best time to rotate into a really dominant position, because for the most part, you're not going to accomplish anything just spamming damage at targets that are standing in a Luna ult, because they're just going to heal to full instantly anyway. So while both teams are sort of chaotically clashing inside of their support ults, you can simply walk to a high ground or to a flank and set yourself up, because as soon as those supports are done with their ultimate, they're going to start to backpedal, and they're not going to be thinking about being flanked. They're going to be looking at their teammates that they're leaving. So it usually means you can actually catch them off guard and get a pick right after they're done with their ultimate, which will set your team up to win the post fight. Okay, so with a basic understanding of positioning, let's talk about when we should be using Hela and when we should not be using Hela. First though, make sure you like and subscribe, because I play Hela all the time, so there's going to be plenty more videos on her to watch. I think that the absolute worst time to be using Hela is against a super dive heavy enemy team. Hela is a very strong duelist, however, she does not have a lot of survivability against a coordinated dive. If the enemy team is running something like Cap, Thor, Panther, and they're just committing onto you over and over and over again, you may be able to survive, but a lot of the time you're going to find that's really all you're doing. The dive will put the enemies right in your face, which is going to make your shots harder to hit, since Hela would really like to be fighting in that sort of mid-range environment. And then by the time you bird away, you're either going to be very easy for them to chase and kill, because you don't bird very far for dive characters, or you're going to be so weak and in such a poor position that you can't really contribute to the fight as much as you would like. In these cases, it's usually better to just play a character that has more mobility, more survivability, and that's overall just a less effective dive target. So with that in mind, when are the best times to be playing Hela? Well, the best times to be playing Hela are when the enemy team is sort of oriented around playing for angles, or they're playing characters that you can consistently take 1v1s with. I think Hela is one of the best ranked characters simply because if there's not a cohesive unit on the other team, you know, if there's a lone Psylocke flanking or just a lone Iron Man in the sky that doesn't have, you know, Ultron and Storm with him, whatever else, you can be a really punishing force for those kinds of lone wolf players. Because it's just a 1v1 and because you have such high damage output, you can usually get the kill on them before they can even react. Hela is also very good when the enemy team is much more spam oriented and can't shut you off of angles super easily. As an example, let's say the enemy team is running Squirrel Girl and Punisher. I know that I can kill their DPSs on Hela much quicker than they are able to kill me. So this means I can take much more aggressive angles, I can get picks, and I can play around that knowledge much more effectively. Alright, so now that that has hopefully shed some light on when Hela is best, let me cover how to get more value out of her abilities. Hela's secondary fire will throw out blades that deal impact damage, and then they explode shortly after for more damage. And I pretty much use these in one of two ways. Number one, which is probably the way I use them the most, is to deal better sustained damage against high HP enemies such as tanks or like Rocket's ultimate, things like that. However, they do have a viable second usage, which is to combine them with your stun, especially when an enemy is hiding on a corner. I can simply throw my blades to the floor, I can wait a second, and then throw my stun on top of the blades to drag an enemy over them as they explode. And then I can also try to hit that enemy with another shot or a headshot while they're pulled out from around that corner, and that will give me a kill a lot of times on someone who was not expecting it. You pretty much never want to use this ability in a 1v1, especially against somebody who's not using a corner. Against the squishier targets like Psylocke or another Hela, for example, it'll actually reduce your short-term damage output and it traps you into an animation for a bit. So it's usually better to just go for your primary fires in that duel, because if you can hit your shots, you're going to get the kill much quicker. As for Hela's bird, it's very useful as both a chasing tool and an escaping tool, and you should always be super reserved when using it. It really has a lot of different situations that it can be good in, but here are the 3 most common in my experience. Number 1 is for escaping dives or heavy amounts of damage coming from stuff like ults, you know, whether it's Strange ult, or it's a Phoenix ult, or it's just a team diving you, that kind of stuff. It's really good for just escaping that if you time it right. Number 2 is for surprising enemies who are on high grounds by birding up to them and then using your stun combo to catch them off guard and get that free kill. And then number 3, which is to chase a weak enemy around a corner when it's worth the risk, you know, such as, let's say you got an enemy support down to 1 HP and they have their ult ready and you know they have their ult ready. You can bird around that corner to get that one surprise shot off to maybe get the final blow on them. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that I see with Hela Bird is, especially when people have ult, they'll use their bird to fly in and then they'll ult afterwards in the middle of the enemy team. On one hand, this does set you up in a generally pretty good ult spot, but here's the issue. When you land, you're going to be super vulnerable, especially if they focus you. Because you just birded, and because you're now deep in the enemy backline, you're going to be stuck. You don't have great movement, you don't have great survivability, so odds are they're just going to kill you, and if you mistimed your ult, or if they actually sat and focused you, you've just died for no reason. You've given up an ult and a pick. If you really want to go for a close Hela ult like that, I would recommend you just walk up while shooting and see if you can get somebody weak before you use your ult, and then use your ult when they actually start looking at you. That way, after you land, you have your bird ready to get out of a bad situation. Hela's stun is pretty straightforward. Just keep in mind that it can stop enemy ultimates like Strange halfway through, so it's very good to be mindful of when the enemy is looking for an ult that you can stun. But other than that, you're mainly going to be using it to hit combos in 1v1s where you fire a shot, you throw the stun, and then you fire another shot as they're stuck. If they have a little bit of range away, you can actually throw the stun first because it's a projectile, so it has to travel. That will be very effective against unaware targets like the enemy supports that you might be flanking. You throw your stun, it travels to them, and you're already firing your shots as it hits, so you can really combo the damage very quickly. And just a reminder, as I mentioned before, you can also use it close to a corner where someone is standing to pull them out around the corner, which would then let you get a last hit on them if they're weak. For her 2 passive abilities, I'm just going to briefly touch on them since they're helpful, but they're not super dynamic in how many ways you can actually use them. The first passive is when she gets an elimination on a target, a crow will form shortly before it explodes and deals damage to anyone who's still alive. The only real way to get extra value out of this is by using your stun to pull enemies into it as it gets ready to explode. Otherwise, it's most of the time just going to be free extra damage. And her second passive is her ability to gently float down by holding the jump key. This isn't always that helpful, but you can sometimes use it to get surprise shots on people floating down from high grounds. Or if I see a 1 HP support deep in the enemy backline, I'll actually sometimes bird straight up into the air and then float down while I'm trying to get that final blow on them. Finally, we have her ultimate, and you want to be mindful of the enemy team's damage and their shielding. I personally find it to be a good trade if I can force an enemy support to use their ult for mine at the beginning of a fight, because it then will give us an advantage when it comes to our support ult timing. And what I mean by that is, let's say both teams have Luna Snow and Cloak and Dagger for their support ults. If I force the enemy Luna Snow to use her ultimate, and then mine uses hers 3 seconds later, we have 3 seconds extra of support ult timing. That means that by the time the enemy Luna's ult is up, we're still pushing. Now the enemy Cloak has to use her ultimate, because we're pushing with an ult, so we have a massive advantage for 3 seconds. But now our cloak has ultimate, so no matter what, we're always going to be 3 seconds ahead if I can force that support ult early enough. However, if you brainlessly use your ult at the start without thinking of something, like an enemy strange flying up to you and shielding, you're just going to get your ult blocked and there's not much that you can actually do about it. So think about the ways that enemies can counter your ultimate, Angela, strange flying up to you, Magneto ult, that kind of stuff, and focus on pressuring those targets first, or at least waiting until they use their cooldowns. For strange, he has to use his fly to get up to you, so if you see him use that at some point, you can ult safely. You don't always have to break his shield entirely. The other thing to keep in mind is damage focus from the enemy team. If you're not trading for a support ult and you're wanting to win a fight with your ultimate, you need to use it while the enemy team is occupied. Use it as your team is starting to crash into them, so they have their attention split and have to decide between shooting the tanks that are running them down or shooting you out of the air. My last ult tip, which is actually something that comes up a lot, especially when I'm climbing at the start of season or just playing against lower ranks, is against Penny Parker, and it's really simple. Penny loves to place her mines down on the floor under you so that you die as soon as you land from your ultimate. So before your timer is up, just make sure against Penny Parker, you throw a crow down under your feet just to clear any mines or hazards. You would actually be surprised how often this comes up against pennies, especially ones that are sort of approaching that point where they've seen a few videos or just have learned over time. All right, a couple of quick tips on how to hit more shots. These are going to be very short because overall aim training is what you really need to get better. Just time put in and just a concerted effort to get better at aiming. But a couple of quick little hacks you can use are, one, when you're dealing with a target who is strafing side to side very quickly, instead of trying to hit them at the edge of their strafes, center your crosshair in the middle of their movement, and when they're going back and forth, they'll just kind of walk into it. And the last tip I want to give, and this especially is true for new players, but is important for everybody to always refresh themselves on, is having good crosshair placement. As you turn corners and you're swinging out into chokes, you want to have your crosshair set as close to where you think the enemies will be as possible. A lot of players are going to use their eyes to look around their screen instead of using their crosshair to look around as they walk out. And what I mean by that is you should always have your eyes kind of centered on your crosshair. And if you want to look to your left, don't just look with your eyes. Look with your crosshair. Move to the left. Face your character that way. Doing this will make your first shots, which are your most important ones, much likelier to actually hit. So set your crosshair on corners as you swing around them and be ready to fight as soon as you're in open view of the other team. That's all. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe.